Well, hello everyone. Welcome to a live stream for History Vibe podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Donald V. Redford. Professor Redford is a historian and philologist of Northeast Africa and the Near East. He was trained in Semitics and Akkadian under W. Lambert, J. V. Kinnier-Wilson, and A. Sachs, and in Egyptian language under R. A. Parker, H. J. Polotsky and R. Caminos. From 1964 to 1967, he served under Dame Kathleen Kenyon in the excavations of the old city of Jerusalem. In 1976, he discovered the oldest temple of the heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten, and in subsequent years revealed a major domestic area of the capital city of Thebes. From 1991, his annual expeditions to Mendes and the Nile Delta have contributed to our knowledge of the advent of complex society and state formation in Egypt circa 3100 BCE, and have refined and added to our knowledge of Egypt in the Late and Hellenistic Periods circa 700 to 200 BCE. Professor Redford has produced and advised over 30 successful PhD candidates, all of them having achieved placement. Redford's work in editing the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, published in 2001, earned the American Library Association Dartmouth Medal for a reference work of outstanding quality and significance. Since 2006, he is also in the editorial board of RIHAO. That is RIHAO. Currently, Donald Redford is professor at Pennsylvania University. Today's live stream interview will be based on his book, Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times. The link to purchase his book is in the description below. And with that being said, I would like to begin with the following question, because the questions today will center around the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, who they are, and their connection to the biblical Exodus story. So, Professor Redford, could you tell us a bit about who the Hyksos are, for those that may not be familiar?
Okay. The term itself, Hyksos, is an ancient Egyptian term, and it refers not to the race that we're involved with, but rather with the identification of the political head of state. That the Egyptians would apply this term in their language. It was pronounced Hekahasut, and they would apply this to any foreign ruler. For example, Artaxerxes III, a Persian king, was called by the Egyptians a Hyksos. He was a foreigner and he was a ruler. So it's not a racial designation. That's an important point right off the bat, because there are still books out there, learned tomes, that don't really see that and don't countenance it. So once we have that straight, then we can ask who they were, and we do know, there's no secret about it, that well, the Egyptians have told us. They came into contact with these people, and they were aware that they spoke a different language and had different culture. The language identified these people as what the Egyptians heard on their lips as A'amu, A'amu. But that really is, it means West Semitic speaking person, Amorite speaking person. And so that's why, if you studied the Hyksos, not that there's that much to study, because once they were ejected from the country, they didn't come back, and they melded in with the local Levantine population. That is how the Egyptians themselves would have identified these people as Amorites. And they spoke a language, well, basically Amorite. Members of that subfamily are, well, you've got a couple of North Syrian dialects, the Phoenician language along the Mediterranean coast, Aramaic, which is a separate language, in the Damascus area and inland, and then everything watered by the Jordan and the sources of the Jordan would be Southern Canaanite, I suppose. I don't know what the term is, but the languages of Canaan at that time would have been Hebrew, and then the dialects of Hebrew in Transjordan, making up a great package of languages that we call West Semitic. And that explains, to a certain extent, why, if you look at the names that that are floating around in the 18th, 17th centuries before Christ in the Eastern Mediterranean, you'll find many, many names that have a biblical ring, and names that we're all familiar with, like Yaakov and Yosef and Abraham and whatnot. These are good Amorite names, and they occurred back in the Middle Bronze Age, say from the 18th century to the 16th, something like that. And so that gives us a kind of a running start. Now we know what we're looking for, and it's a very exciting search that we can make.
Can you tell us a bit more about those Amorite names, how they sounded and how similar they sound to the Semitic names that you just mentioned?
Yeah. Well, I can name what I used to do was to haul out the Bible, the first book, Genesis, and go through genealogies and you know, of any of the families of Abraham and Yitzhak and whatnot. And so you have names that I presume would have been pronounced Aviram, Abisha, Yaakov, Yosef, Ishmael, and so forth. Each of those forms is a kind of a precative form. That is, it expresses a wish. Ishmael, oh may God hear. And Yaakov, probably, oh may God, it should have been Yaakov El, oh may God triumph or cause me to triumph or something like that. Well, my mind's going blank now, but they're scattered throughout the stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so that there's no doubt that we're in that great language family. And, I must say too that one area that I would expect something really important to come from is the mining area in the Sinai Peninsula. On the west side, there is a site called Sarbat el Kadim, and this is a mine for, well, not so much copper, but turquoise, which the Egyptians prized highly. And there was a temple there and whatnot. And some of the very earliest alphabetic script inscriptions come from that temple. And they appear not to have been written by Egyptians, but rather by West Semitic speaking people. And since the date of these inscriptions, an educated guess would place them between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, well, right in the Hyksos period. And I really look forward to somebody, once the dust settles, to go into that area and continue work that has been going on ever since Petrie back in 1905, I think it was, first went there and found all these inscriptions in a very early alphabetic script. And they're pious inscriptions asking a particular god to favor the writer and so forth, what you would expect. But that that very, very ancient alphabet, whether it was derived from the Egyptian script or was inspired by the Egyptian script, I don't know. But at any rate, it is alphabetic, and you can see the origins of some of the Hebrew characters that we later find, and also the Arabic alphabet, and eventually the Greek and the Roman come off that evolutionary spin. So this is really exciting. Just wish I could hang around long enough. Anyway.
I would like to ask about the Amorite tribe led by King Amnamnam. King Amnamnam was the king of the Benu Jamna tribe.
King of who? Sorry?
The Benu Jamna tribe. Benu Jamna.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes,
It appears to, and it would appear to be evidence that the tribe of Benjamin is derived from that, and is indicative it is originally an Amorite tribe. Would you say that's further evidence of the type of the connections that you were showing between the Amorite names and the Semitic names in the Bible?
Yes, I think so. The tribe of Benjamin calls up the tribe, I guess it was, at Mari on the Euphrates in the 18th century BC, and there they were called the Banu Yamina, the left-handed guys, and so that's a connection that I like to explore, but I haven't yet, and others will do it before me, but and have done so. But at any rate, the tablets from Mari. Mari was a great Amorite city-state on the Euphrates in the Bronze Age, Middle Bronze, and it was an imperial city, very large, and the French excavating between the two world wars found traces of the archives of the city, and it is important for biblical historians because the city of Mari was in constant contact with some of the big city-states in what was later to become the kingdom of David and Solomon, that area in there. Now we would be looking at the scene approximately 800 years before David and Solomon. But nevertheless, the archives that have been excavated and translated mention biblical places such as Hatzor and Byblos and whatnot. So they were in contact with these biblical cities, and so that I'm sure will provide us with a lot of new information once it's studied.
So now I would like to shift directly to the Hyksos invasion itself. Was the Hyksos invasion, and since the connections between the Hyksos and Amorites were clear, did the Hyksos invasion represent the Amorites themselves, like as a whole, invading Egypt, or were they a sect of the Amorites, a different group of them of their society that invaded, or did the entire society plunge into war against Egypt?
It wasn't the entire, but we really don't know that. Manetho, who surprisingly is sometimes our best evidence, although certain people wouldn't think so, and he's had a bad press, I know, but Manetho thinks of them as Phoenicians coming from Phoenicia, and that would mean they spoke Phoenician, which is a branch of West Semitic, and we know it's fairly well known. The language is, of course, known. There are grammars and dictionaries written in it. So it would be, I imagine, if we ever get our hands on some really good, solid evidence through archaeology, and I'm sure it's out there, I think we would see that one principality in Western Asia, probably closer to the Egyptian border than, say, Beirut is, on one occasion, the circumstances escape us, but that may come, decided that they were going to march on Egypt. And it was a military affair. And it was almost a surprise attack because, as Manetho describes it, they seized Egypt almost, on the spot without having to fire a cannon or discharge a bolt. And they, according to Manetho, they treated the inhabitants rather poorly and sent the 13th dynasty flying southward to Luxor, where they eventually disappeared, the 13th dynasty. And the Hyksos divided the country in half, the northern part going to the Hyksos and the southern part remaining in the hands of the local inhabitants. So that's about all we can say, but the archaeology on the ground is amazing. The sites that have been identified as Hyksos, excuse me, show no trace whatsoever of Egyptian culture. It's almost as though, for say, the great city of Varis, which came to be the capital or second capital maybe of the Hyksos, the entire city has no Egyptian cultural traits at all. The burials are entirely West Semitic. The pottery is not Egyptian at all. It's very nice pottery, MB2AB, I think. No Egyptian stuff anywhere to be seen. And they built giant strong points, the like of which is really fantastic. What were they afraid of? I don't know, but they certainly were making an impression on the Egyptians. These were really master soldiers, and the idea got started that they're almost invincible. But in fact, at the end, it turned out not to be so at all. But that's one of the things that always interests me. Why did they not take to Egyptian ways? It's curious, except for the very last king or the last important king of the 15th dynasty, which is the Hyksos dynasty, who made a point of learning the hieroglyphs. And he boasts that he can read the ancient texts better than anybody else, even though he isn't an Egyptian. And other things he mentions that are almost little footnotes in his inscriptions to what he has done as a king. And he talks of himself as waging wars in far-off countries, the inhabitants of which have never seen him and don't know him. This is rather curious, but we should remember also that this fellow's name was Apophis, and he reigned for 35 years, a good long life. But he comes at the very end, and it's interesting that he is mentioned in Greek mythology. His name there is vocalized a little differently. It's Epaphos, but he is well known. Well, the whole thing boils down to, for me, little bits and pieces of evidence that are so separated one from another. You can't postulate any causation yet until we find a new big discovery, and that may come for sure.
What do you make of the 1st century CE Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who says that the Hyksos are the same people as the ancient Israelites that fled Egypt in the Exodus?
Yes, I'm a fan of Josephus, by the way, so But I guess he could make mistakes, but I don't think he's made a mistake here. Um, although I think what he would be saying if we really pinned him down on this was that, yes, my ancestors came out of that broader linguistic stock. And you can trace, of course, a kind of continuum right from the times of the patriarchs right on down. That doesn't mean that others were not part of this great family tree as well. It's always amazing to me to have students read the Mesha inscription from Moab. It sounds like a chapter out of Second Samuel. I mean, it's entirely in very, very, we would say, good Hebrew, although that's the language cluster in the south. So he's onto something. He remembers that his own nation did have their roots back in this period of the Middle Bronze, when the languages of the West Semitic family were going strong and developing into the later countries that we see in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're indebted to Josephus for some of the passages he translates from Manetho, the Egyptian historian. And he didn't like Manetho, and I think, well, Manetho didn't know about him. I don't think they didn't live in the same century. But at any rate, he is, we're indebted to him, to Josephus, for quoting in extenso passages from Manetho. And I wish he had done more. Manetho was still around in as an intact document as late as the 1st century before Christ. And then it disappeared, but not before somebody had done a précis or a digest of the whole thing. And that's all we have today, apart from what Josephus translated. So we always hope that maybe somewhere in Switzerland and in an old church or something like that, somebody's going to turn up in the old library a manuscript of Manetho. That would be just terrific. Anyhow, I think he was on the right track. That's not a mistake, actually.
Some are curious to know, since it is believed that the Jewish language has Egyptian roots, were the Hyksos, who are presumably the ancient Israelites, are they really a foreign people? Or do they actually come from Egypt? Or are they totally foreign?
The Hyksos, the Amorites?
Yeah.
No, they didn't come from Egypt. Their place of origin is put down as Mount Bishri, which is up in North Syria somewhere. Whether that's accurate or true, I don't know, but it might be. The principalities surrounding that part of North Syria that eventually appear on the scene at about the same time that we were talking of, the Hyksos invasion. They continue on and simply dominate the society, inscriptions, other written forms, right on down into the late period. They're always there, and they're always called Amuru, Amorites. So I don't know. We need more evidence. I keep telling myself that it's maybe it'll come true someday that we find a great cache of text.
And when we look at the battles and the surviving texts that tell us about it, both contemporary and much later, texts, and we see that Pharaoh Kamudi, the last pharaoh of the Hyksos during the war that they had with Egypt. And we read that Pharaoh Amos the first, who succeeds Sequenary Pharaoh Sequenary Tao, was killed in the battlefield, apparently,
Right.
by 3 strikes to the head. The Amos decides, like, he lets them leave Egypt after they are defeated. But then he changes his mind and decides, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pursue them anyway. Does that in some sense remind you of the unnamed Pharaoh of the Exodus who let the Jews go and then said, I take that back, I'm going to chase you?
Yeah. I don't know. That never occurred to me before. The impression you get from the biography, we're all dependent, by the way, on the biography of Ahmasi Siabina, who was an admiral of the fleet, and failing an inscription by Pharaoh Ahmasi himself, which is out there. We know that, but it hasn't come to light yet. But the situation at the end of the Hyksos occupation, the last, say, 5 years or so, really is to the credit of Ahmasi, the younger brother of Kamasi, who finally kicked them out of Egypt. And the impression you get from how Ahmasi Siabina describes the next phase is that it followed immediately. That is the decision to lay siege to Sheruhen. And you see, for about 75 years after the expulsion of the Hyksos, or even longer than that, the Egyptians really were scared that they were coming back. And they, right down to Thutmose III's reign, who created the empire, of course, he speaks of preemptive strikes. We can't let them get close to our borders again. We've got to do something about this. Let's strike them as they are on the march against us. So that's classic, preemptive strike. It was only with the complete defeat of the Canaanites by Thutmose III in several battles that fear was proven to be not real. But it's incredible that the great Pharaoh Thutmose I and his grandson Thutmose III expressing doubts as to whether there will be an attempt to occupy the country again.
And we're also told that the Hyksos destroyed Jericho, just like the biblical Israelites are also attributed to destruction of Jericho, and it's also reported by Flavius Josephus in the 1st century CE that the Hyksos supposedly built Jerusalem after their expulsion. What do you make of that?
Well, that's getting into legend that there was this great in Ptolemaic times, that is 3 centuries there before Christ. There was a kind of Judeo pagan polemic, and you see that in the debate that Josephus has with Manetho, and this led to a number of crazy stories, basically, about the Jews. And Josephus is bent on looking in contemporary literature, that is the 1st century, and routing out all these nonsense stories, which really are pejorative, basically, and seeing who the author was, and then he provides a rebuttal, and there are about 6 that I published all of them actually in a book on kingless annals and daybooks, in ancient Egypt. And so in the course of this grand debate, um, Josephus takes the work of Manetho and a guy called Apion and another Lysimachus and whatnot. We don't know much about these others, but they're all kind of anti-Semitic in their approach. And Josephus engages in this debate. And out of it comes the most distorted kind of tradition or legendary hodgepodge that you can imagine. And for example, and I'm writing on this, that's why I'm full of it actually. The one development of that kind of story, that kind of it's not myth, it's almost myth, but it's more legend basically. One spin-off that is a complete misreading of chronology. Appian and his confreres place the Exodus from Egypt in the 7th century BC, not the 14th, as the biblical chronology suggests. Well, whether that's another problem, whether that date is even accurate. So there's an awful lot of material here. So all of this debating and hauling in evidence to support your case that really isn't evidence at all. It's error upon error. And so that is one thing that has to be taken into account. I'm very interested in finding out how the Exodus story actually was transmogrified or translated into this later hodgepodge of nonsense. And it seems to have come about at the end of the Saite period and the beginning of the Persian period. That is around 500 BC. And so anyway, it's well, I better stop now.
What made Appian think that the Exodus happened in the 7th century BC? Does he explain?
No, he doesn't. And in fact, he probably contained more material than we imagine. And I don't know what he did with that material, because both notions coexist, namely that you have one set of stories that are reasonably accurate, and another set of stories that get it all wrong in terms of date. I think we're kind of touching here on an oral culture, oral stories, and once you get unchecked orality, wow, then the sky's the limit in terms of the number of mistakes you can. Yeah, but it's interesting. I must say, and scholars have done a job on it, to take a look at the Alexandrian Jewish community in Alexandria, because you got some pretty great intellectuals there. And just to go through some of the apocryphal books by this fellow Artapan, I don't know who he was, but a member of the Jewish community in the 2nd century. And then there's Eumolpus and several others. And they are curiously tapping into what was circulating in intellectual circles, I guess, in Alexandria and other similar cities of the Eastern Empire. And much of it is new, if you haven't studied it before, of course it's new, but is rather interesting, and I think that it should be targeted again by scholars, because there is, for example, Artapanus gives a kind of what you might call a midrash to the biblical stories of Joseph and Moses. And Artapanus doesn't exist except in a watered down digest. So we don't have his magnum opus, but his magnum opus dealt with Moses. And there are all sorts of new motifs in there, and new plots and new people. And whether we should accept this or not, I'm not arguing that, but there were lots of good ideas and stories floating there that never come to our attention 2,000 years later. Anyway, it's there's all sorts of food for further study here. I wanted to mention. Oh, just as
go ahead.
As Artapanus preserves. I'm not sure he realized it, but he preserves a different. Well, he knows the figure of Moses as a great sheikh or a tribal leader coming from the east. Okay, so and he honors that, of course. But then there is this other tradition that links him with a Libyan tribe, and with the Cushites to the south, the Nubians, and it all depends apparently on a verse in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1, in which it stated that Miriam and Aaron and Miriam were angry with Moses over the fact that he had married a Cushite woman. And then the chapter goes on and never comes back to that point. But it seems as though there was this tradition of a Cushite woman. And not that this need be followed or accepted, but at any rate, it shows that people of the day were launching out into other areas and seeing the great heroic figure of Moses doing other things and involved in other traditions. I find that interesting.
Some compare the Minoan eruption, which they see as happening around or not too long before the Hyksos left Egypt, and they compare that to the 12 plagues. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm sort of intrigued by the fact that in the, what would it be, the 11th year of Ahmose, the liberator, the guy that threw them out, there occurred these strange happenings in the atmosphere. I don't know if you've read the translation of the Unwetterstelle, the bad weather stele, in which Ahmose records, and he's also, by recording it, he's placating the gods, and they're forgiving Egypt for goodness knows what kind of sins. But the event itself was a storm of some sort, really a very, very serious storm that flattened that part of Egypt where cities were and habitations, and it raised a great dust cloud so that no fire could be lit, and you couldn't see your neighbor's eyes. Terrible. People were dying and drowning in the Nile and whatnot. And there's thunder constantly. That can't be denied. I think there's something behind this, and as we have the fragment of a diary of somebody, maybe a doctor from Avaris, which in very terse language describes this celestial storm, and of course they identify the fellow bringing the thunder with Seth, the enemy of Osiris. It's always nice to pin it on that god. But then it goes on to describe how Avaris was captured and the enemy, the Hyksos, were allowed to retire. Now, that particular incident, you can't help, I don't think, you can't help but call to mind Santorini and the explosion of that island, except that I think the dates they got it wrong. But I'm not sure of that at all. But it's almost too good to be true to have a similar cataclysm, within the same century. But to date it, I think they're dating it now around 1620. That would seem to me to be 80 years too early. But again, it's not my field. But this could be the first incident that sparked the notion of the plagues. I don't know. I haven't myself studied the plagues to any great extent, but that there might be a real historical background to this. I could understand that and accept it.
Some wonder that if the Jews are the Hyksos, if they're the same people, how come they didn't brag about ruling Egypt? How come they wrote the story the way they did in the Book of Exodus as being one of enslavement and not a war?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good question. I myself, I would think of the stories told of the patriarchs, and the Joseph story and the Moses material as all of a piece, in a sense, all of a piece. And harking back to the Bronze Age, when these stories must have been told and circulated and lived on in the oral tradition of an element which later was part of the Israelite and the federation of the 12 tribes, but that the memory wasn't all that strong, and that since we're separated from maybe 8 centuries or more, I mean, I suppose it's something like myself, identifying with Anglo-Saxon family in England in the 12th century, and the descendants of my family at that stretch, that chronological stretch, would certainly have lost certain aspects of the 1 or 2 incidents that should have reminded me of where I came from and whatnot. I don't know, that wouldn't pose problems to me.
And some are curious as to some might be curious as to how Osarsiv connects to this, because Josephus, when quoting Manifu, also brings up this Osarsiv character and how Osarsiv wanted to bring the Hyksos back into Egypt for a second invasion, and he seems to be identified as Moses. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, he is. That's right. There's a lot been written about Osarsiv. One scholar, a German colleague of mine, Jan Assmann, identifies him with Osiris. I don't know where we can go with that, but I've thought that these are two Egyptian words that Heru and Seba, and both of these terms, Heru means enemy, and Seba means insurrectionist, somebody who's rising up against the government. And in text after Akhenaten's reign, but within the next century, when they have to refer to Akhenaten, they always refer to that enemy or that rebel. And that would come out as Ochar and Seba. So I'm just wondering whether that's, these terms, which are really insulting and pejorative, go back to the event itself. Yeah, that particular, it's almost a cycle of stories of how one king wanted desperately to see the gods on earth, so he could see what they looked like, and that is the mainspring for the entire story. And that also is one of the motifs that gets the date wrong of the 7th or 8th century BC rather than the 14th. And so it's a kind of a tangled web of traditions here. And people, well, some of my colleagues, I guess, are still working on it, but seems to me that they've moved on to other things. There comes a time when the sources, the evidence dries up and you're rethreshing old straw. So we all always crave some new material, new evidence.
And in my closing question, do you think it's possible that the main reason that they wanted to disassociate from their failed war against Egypt is because that they failed? Could it have been that they were embarrassed that they were defeated and they had to leave Egypt, and that's why they created this enslavement story to obscure their identity as being the Amorite Hyksos foreigners that invaded Egypt?
Well, that's that's really ingenious. I'm not sure that I could
Thanks.
accept that. There's one problem I always have is with this return of the Hyksos, that they were invited back, and what in the story, and not in historic fact, we don't know, but in the legend itself, they get invited back, and then it's almost a reprise of the original ejection into the desert. I'll have to sleep on that. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Redford.